Rich black man kicked out of restaurant, returns as the new boss. Arthur Mitchell stepped out of his car, admiring the sleek lines of the new restaurant that had been the talk of the town. The place gleamed with opulence, the polished glass exterior reflecting the golden hues of the setting sun. Tonight was supposed to be simple, a quiet dinner before his business meeting tomorrow, a chance to unwind. But as he adjusted his jacket, Arthur caught a glimpse of his reflection in the window. Tall, dignified, black, a man who had built his success brick by brick. Yet he knew that here, where old money met white privilege, those bricks still meant nothing to some. He steeled himself before walking in. The restaurant was all grandeur, the low hum of conversations blending with the clink of wine glasses. The dark wood paneling and chandeliered ceilings were a testament to exclusivity, the kind that whispered, "Not for you." Arthur had the wealth to eat here 1,000 times over, but his experience told him that wouldn't stop the questions or the quiet doubts people harbored. As he approached the hostess stand, a young woman with carefully styled blonde hair greeted him, her name tag gleaming under the dim light. Jessica. She flashed a practiced smile, but the falter in her eyes was unmistakable as they lingered a little too long on his face. She quickly corrected her expression, but Arthur had already seen it, a brief flicker of unease, of something just beneath the surface. "Good evening, sir. Do you have a reservation?" Her voice was polite, yet somehow cold, like she was reciting lines from a script she didn't quite believe in. Arthur, who had called ahead precisely to avoid any hassle, nodded. "Yes, under Mitchell." Jessica's fingers fluttered over the reservation book, a little slower than they should have. I don't see that name here," she said, not even bothering to look up. The tone had shifted, though she was still smiling. "We're actually fully booked tonight. Sorry about that." Arthur glanced past her at the dining area. His eyes fell on at least 6 empty tables, neatly set with no sign of imminent guests. His jaw tightened. "You sure? Looks like a few are open," Arthur said, calm but not backing down. Jessica's fingers twitched against the counter. "Hi, I'm afraid those are for reservations, sir," she replied, her gaze darting around like a trapped animal. "Maybe if you'd called earlier, we could found a spot for you." Her voice was dripping with something unspoken, a hint of condescension wrapped in fake politeness. Arthur felt a familiar knot tightening in his chest. He'd seen this too many times, disguised as a mistake or an unfortunate misunderstanding. But the truth was there in her body language, the stiffened posture, the way she avoided his eyes, how her smile had lost any trace of warmth. Before he could respond, the manager appeared, striding toward them with an air of authority. Clive. His name was pinned on his chest in bold letters. He looked Arthur up and down with an assessing glance, his lip curling ever so slightly, as though he found something distasteful. "Is there a problem here?" Clive asked, his voice tight, like someone handling an inconvenient situation they'd rather not be bothered with. "No problem," Arthur said, his voice low and controlled, though a quiet fury bubbled beneath his calm exterior. "Seems like you're full tonight." Clive's smile was thin, his eyes flat. "Yes, unfortunately, we're fully booked. Perhaps another time might work better for you." There was an odd emphasis on "for you," the words dripping with a condescending tone that sent a spark of anger shooting through Arthur's veins. The tension between the two men crackled in the air, heavy and suffocating. Arthur took a step closer, his towering frame casting a shadow over Clive. "It's funny," Arthur said slowly, his eyes locked on the manager's. "I made a reservation, and I can clearly see you have tables available. But somehow, I'm still being turned away." Clive's smile faltered, his fingers twitching by his side. "I assure you, sir, there's been no mistake." Arthur interrupted, his voice rising, his patience thinning. "Because it feels like you're trying to push me out." Clive straightened, his posture turning defensive. "I think you're reading too much into this," he said, his voice now cool and dismissive. "Maybe a different restaurant would suit your needs better." Arthur's eyes narrowed, the insult hanging in the air like a slap. "My needs," he repeated, his voice sharp. "And what exactly are those, Clive?" For a moment, Clive looked taken aback, but he quickly regained his composure, his smile returning, though it was tight with tension. "I didn't mean anything by it," he said, his voice carefully measured. "We just try to cater to a certain clientele here." The unspoken words were clear, "not you." Arthur took a step back, inhaling deeply to keep his temper in check. "Right," he said, his voice steady again, but the fire in his eyes unmistakable. "I'll take my business elsewhere, but don't worry, I'll be back." Clive raised an eyebrow, confused, but Arthur didn't offer any more explanation. As he turned to leave, he couldn't help but feel the gazes of the staff burning into his back, their silent judgments lingering long after he stepped out into the night. This wasn't over. The next morning, Arthur sat quietly in his spacious corner office, his eyes fixed on the skyline of the city that stretched out beneath him. The room was a symbol of everything he had built. Mitchell Enterprises, a company forged through years of hard work, resilience, and sheer determination. Each skyscraper, every towering building outside his window was a reflection of his journey, from the son of working-class parents to a respected and powerful businessman. But as Arthur stared at the city below, there was something deeper simmering within him, a weight that settled in his chest. Last night's encounter at the restaurant had left a bitter aftertaste, a familiar one. It wasn't the first time he'd been judged, not for his accomplishments, but for the color of his skin. It was the quiet, polite rejection, the unspoken assumption that a black man like him didn't belong in a place of such class and status. He had encountered this discrimination in every stage of his life, in boardrooms, at upscale social gatherings, even in places where he was the one footing the bill. For Arthur, each instance was a reminder that, no matter how much success he amassed, some people would never see past the surface. They would never recognize the man beneath the suit, the man who had worked twice as hard to stand where he did, the man whose worth extended far beyond the skin they so quietly judged. Sitting in his office, Arthur clenched his jaw. The restaurant's dismissive attitude the night before hadn't just been an insult. It was yet another moment that made him feel like an outsider in a world he had every right to be a part of. The encounter had stirred old memories. He thought about the times he had walked into job interviews, knowing that the moment he stepped through the door, his resume would be overshadowed by the color of his skin. Or the business meetings where he had spoken last, his ideas brushed aside until someone else repeated them, claiming them as their own. The moments were many, and the quiet indignity of it all gnawed at him. But Arthur had never let these experiences define him. They had shaped him, yes, but they had also taught him a lesson. Success was the greatest form of resistance, and over the years that philosophy had propelled him forward, building his company, proving his doubters wrong, and rising above the discrimination that tried to box him in. Now this situation with the restaurant was no different. He had felt the burn of rejection last night, but that burn had ignited something within him, something that drove him to act. He wasn't interested in petty revenge or making a scene. That wasn't his style. Instead, he would do what he always did, rise above it with grace, dignity, and precision. A soft knock at the door interrupted his thoughts. Maria, his assistant, stepped in, holding a folder. "Everything's ready, sir. The acquisition is complete as of this morning." Arthur's heart rate quickened for just a moment, but outwardly he remained calm. He reached for the folder, the weight of it in his hands representing so much more than a business deal. He opened it, eyes scanning the final documents. It was official. He was now the majority owner of the restaurant chain that had turned him away last night. His signature was already etched on the dotted line, a formality that sealed not only a business transaction, but also a poetic turn of fate. Arthur closed the folder and leaned back in his chair, staring out the window once more, though this time with a sense of satisfaction. The staff had no idea what was coming. They had dismissed him, judged him, and shooed him away as if he were a nuisance. But now the tables had turned. He felt the simmering anger of last night resurface briefly, the way the hostess had brushed him off, the way the manager had spoken down to him with thinly veiled disdain. But Arthur wasn't one to let anger rule him. No, he knew better than that. The sting of racism was powerful, but he had learned long ago that his power lay in how he responded to it. Revenge would have been too easy, too shallow. Instead, Arthur would use this moment to educate, to shift the narrative. His mind whirled with plans, not for punishment, but for redemption, not just for himself, but for the very people who had wronged him. This was an opportunity to dismantle their prejudices, to make them see him for who he truly was. His phone buzzed on the desk, snapping him out of his thoughts. A text from his lawyer flashed across the screen. Deal is finalized. Public announcement going out now. The staff will be notified shortly. Arthur smiled, but wasn't a smile of victory. It was a smile of quiet satisfaction. He stood, smoothing out his jacket, feeling the weight of the moment sink in. He wasn't just going back to the restaurant to claim ownership. He was going back to make a statement. He was going back to show them that the man they had dismissed was the man who now held the keys to their livelihoods. His steps toward the door were slow and deliberate, each one measured with purpose. He would walk into that restaurant today with his head held high, not because he needed to prove anything, but because he had already proven everything. The staff, the managers, the entire establishment would have no choice but to recognize his power, not the power of money, but the power of grace in the face of prejudice. As he reached for the door, Arthur paused, his fingers brushing the handle. The familiar sensation of being dismissed, of being seen as less, lingered in the back of his mind, but he pushed it aside. Today, he wasn't walking into that restaurant as a victim. He was walking in as the owner. With one final glance at the city beyond his office, Arthur stepped into the hallway, his mind sharp, his heart steady. He wasn't just going to confront the racism he'd faced last night. He was going to transcend it. And in doing so, he'd remind them all that respect wasn't something they could choose to give or withhold. It was something he had already earned. Today, the lesson would be theirs to learn. Arthur walked back into the restaurant that evening, this time with a different purpose. The familiar scent of grilled steaks and fine wine filled the air, but tonight there was an undercurrent of tension, almost as if the walls could sense the power shift that was about to unfold. The staff hadn't yet realized who he was, but there were whispers. Someone had recognized him from the previous night, maybe Jessica, maybe one of the waiters. Either way, eyes followed him as he moved through the space, his presence unsettling them in a way they couldn't quite place. Jessica was at the hostess stand again. When she saw him, her face paled, and there was a flicker of something like recognition in her eyes. But this time, her polite smile was brittle, forced. "Good evening," she said, her voice tight. "Table for one." Arthur nodded. "Yes, I'd like a table, preferably one that's open this time." Jessica flushed, clearly remembering how she had turned him away the night before. She glanced nervously toward the back, where Clive was overseeing the floor. "Of course, sir. Let me just..." Before she could finish, Clive appeared again, cutting her off. His eyes landed on Arthur, and his face tightened with the same uncomfortable recognition. It was subtle, but Arthur saw it. The brief widening of Clive's eyes, the way his mouth twitched before settling into that same false smile. "Welcome back, sir," Clive said, his voice louder than usual, drawing attention from nearby tables. "I hope we can accommodate you properly this evening." Arthur regarded him for a long moment. He could feel the tension in Clive's posture, the way the man's professional mask struggled to hold as the truth began to gnaw at the edges. There was something deeper in Clive's gaze now, fear, or perhaps shame that he wasn't ready to admit. "Actually," Arthur said, his voice steady but carrying weight, "I'm not here just for dinner. I think we need to have a conversation." Clive blinked, taken aback. "A conversation, sir? About what?" Arthur took a slow breath, savoring the moment. "About ownership. Specifically, mine." For a second, the world seemed to pause. Clive's smile froze on his face, and the restaurant fell into a hushed silence, as if the very air had thickened. Eyes turned toward Arthur, the weight of his words sinking in like stones dropped in still water. "What are you talking about?" Clive asked, his voice barely above a whisper, a forced laugh escaping his lips. Arthur's gaze didn't waver. "I own this restaurant now. In fact, I own the entire chain. So, Clive, you'll be answering to me from now on." The color drained from Clive's face. Jessica gasped audibly, her hand flying to her mouth. The other staff members nearby exchanged wide-eyed looks, whispering furiously amongst themselves. Clive took a stumbling step backward, his professional facade crumbling. "You? You're the new owner? Arthur gave a curt nod. Yes, as of this morning, and I'll be making some changes around here. The next few minutes unfolded in stunned silence as Arthur walked past Clive and sat at a table near the center of the room. Jessica scrambled to bring him a menu, her hands trembling as she placed it before him. She opened her mouth to apologize, but Arthur raised a hand, stopping her. "There's no need," Arthur said softly. "I'm not here to punish anyone. I just want things to be right, to be fair." Jessica swallowed hard, blinking back what might have been tears. I didn't know. I didn't mean to." "I know," Arthur interrupted, his voice gentle but firm. "You were just following the same unspoken rules you've seen here for years, but those rules are about to change." Clive stood nearby, his posture deflated, shoulders hunched as though the weight of his actions had finally caught up to him. Arthur looked over at him and motioned for him to come closer. Clive approached slowly, like a man walking to his own execution. "Mr. Mitchell, I." Arthur raised a hand again, silencing him. "I don't need excuses. What I need from you is understanding. You judged me last night, not based on who I am, but based on your assumptions about what I am. Now I'm giving you a chance to change that, but whether you do is up to you." Clive's lips trembled as he spoke, the words heavy with guilt. "I was wrong. I see that now. I shouldn't have treated you the way I did." Arthur studied him for a long moment, searching for sincerity. He saw it there, buried under years of prejudice that had been allowed to fester unchecked. This was the moment of reckoning, not just for Clive, but for the entire restaurant. "I'll give you a choice," Arthur said, his voice steady. "You can either walk away now, or you can stay and prove to me that you're willing to change. But understand this, if you stay, you'll be held to a higher standard." Clive stared at him, his face a mask of conflicting emotions. Finally, he nodded slowly, tears brimming in his eyes. "I want to stay. I want to prove I can be better." Arthur nodded, satisfied. "Then you'll have that chance. But know this, it won't be easy." The room remained quiet as Arthur ordered his meal, now served with deference by the staff who had once been so quick to dismiss him. The tension hung thick in the air, but something else stirred as well, a sense of possibility, of change. As Arthur ate, he reflected on the events of the past 24 hours. He had come expecting nothing more than a quiet dinner, but he had found himself in the center of a reckoning, not just for the restaurant, but for the people who worked there. And as much as this victory felt personal, it wasn't just about him. It was about something bigger. Something that wouldn't change overnight, but could change step by step with each decision, each confrontation of injustice, each moment of truth. By the time he finished his meal, the restaurant had settled into a more subdued rhythm. The staff, though visibly shaken, moved with a renewed sense of purpose. Clive, now working at a distance, still carried the weight of his past mistakes, but there was a glimmer of something in his eyes, perhaps hope or the first signs of redemption. As Arthur stood to leave, he caught Clive's eye one last time. He gave the man a nod, a silent acknowledgement of the journey that lay ahead for both of them. Walking out into the cool night air, Arthur felt a sense of closure. This wasn't just a victory for him, it was a chance for something more. For real change, and as he strode away, he knew that the ripples of this moment would spread far beyond the walls of that restaurant. The world was changing. Slowly, painfully, but it was changing. And Arthur Mitchell was determined to be part of that change, no matter what.